As we talk about the ways in which states cooperate or work together to manage the insecurity of an anarchic world system, we probably should touch on this idea of collective security, what it is, and some of the limitations to collective security as a system of cooperation. And I'll begin by noting that cooperation among states to enhance their own security is not limited just to what we'll be talking about as a collective security system. A collective security system is oftentimes a global system in which all states are members and benefit from the security that comes from participating in that system. It's sort of like an alliance, but alliances oftentimes have states who are members and states who are not members. They provide additional security and safety for those who are part of that alliance community. The NATO alliance, for example, operates under the principle of an attack on one is an attack on all. And so being a member of the NATO alliance brings incredible additional security beyond what states would be able to purchase for themselves if they were simply trying to arm themselves and build up their own militaries. But alliances, unlike a collective security system, which is a global system, where nobody's sort of left on the outside, alliances can have the effect of enhancing the security for members while exacerbating a sense of insecurity for those who are not members of that. And I think probably the classic contemporary example would be NATO's expansion eastward after the end of the Cold War, as states who had historically, during the Cold War, been dominated by the Soviet Union, whether that's Poland or whether that's the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, their sense of insecurity vis-a-vis Russia and sitting on Russia's border prompted them to seek additional security by joining NATO. But as NATO's sort of front and border and influence extends eastward, that exacerbates Russia's sense of insecurity. And frequently Russia sort of complains about this this eastward expansion of NATO as a threat to it. And that's just sort of baked into the cake with alliance systems, right? That they're enhancing the security for some at the expense of security for others, whereas a collective security system is supposed to not have those who are on the outs of that system who feel greater insecurity because that system exists. That's a little abstract, and I'm being a little bit purposely abstract because I want to introduce collective security in its historical context, which is the first time we see a collective security system attempted was after World War I. It was part of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points for reshaping the international system to make it less awful. And one of those was the creation of a League of Nations that would function as a collective security system where aggressor states would be targeted and confronted by the whole of the international community, right? That this community would be confronting aggressive states, and thus individual states would not have to look to their own security through arming themselves, through forming alliances in the way that they had done before, because they would have this enhanced security by being a member of the League of Nations. And while the League of Nations dealt with numerous crises between the end of World War I and the start of World War II, and did so reasonably successfully, it is oftentimes panned in sort of hindsight as something of a failure, and I think that's not unfair given that the institution was created to stop World War II, and we had World War II. One of the reasons that's oftentimes pointed to for why the League of Nations failed is its sort of complex and not even complex, onerous, we'll go with onerous, decision structure. That there was an executive committee that made major decisions, and that executive committee had between 12 and 20 plus members, all of whom had a veto over the decisions of the League of Nations. So essentially it required a unanimity amongst members to act, and that was a really high bar. The other challenge with the League of Nations is that it had no real mechanism to manage or deal with power politics amongst great powers, and the League of Nations system comes crashing down following Japan's invasion of Manchuria. The League sends a delegation to investigate and look into this invasion. It concludes that, well, maybe Japan had some cause, maybe it had been provoked because there had been an explosion on a railroad that Japan had been building that may or may not have been staged by the Japanese military, but regardless, they probably overreacted by invading. It was a really weak report that came back, and Japan denounced it. Germany denounced it. They stormed out of the League of Nations, and the League of Nations did nothing and essentially collapsed as a collective security system. Following the end of World War I or World War II, Franklin Roosevelt pitched a new system, the United Nations system, as a reboot of the League of Nations that would be potentially more effective. Some of the institutional features of the United Nations system are a direct response to the failures of the League of Nations, right? So one of those is that the decision process around when the international community would respond to aggression gets streamlined. It gets placed in the Security Council, which initially has 10 members. It's been expanded to 15, of which 5 would be permanent: the United States, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. And those permanent 5 members would have a veto. So rather than giving every member of the Security Council a veto the way that essentially the Executive Committee did for the League of Nations, it's limited to only the great powers. So power politics is now built into the system, that you only get strong, robust action when those states are in agreement. When Roosevelt was explaining the system to Stalin and how it works so much better than the League of Nations, Stalin sort of asked, I think, coyly, so what would happen if perhaps someday one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, one of these great powers, would possibly invade another country or engage in aggression? And Roosevelt sort of tutted at that and said, well, that wouldn't happen because these 5 states are the guardians of the international system. They're responsible powers with a vested stake in the system, operating in a reasonably stable way, which is an argument in the immediate context of World War II isn't unrealistic. These 5 permanent members are essentially the Allied powers who are pushing back against aggressive states in Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. But also historically, thinking about the League of Nations, I'm thinking about the United Nations Security Council as essentially a concert system, referencing the concert of Europe in the 19th century, where great powers get together and make sure they're moving more or less in agreement, that they're on the same page and that they're working collaboratively to avoid clashing and to avoid conflicts amongst themselves. Okay, so the United Nations system is designed to operate a little bit more effectively, but it still has this foundational problem of how do you identify the aggressor state? The question that sort of plagued the League of Nations when it went to Manchuria to investigate Japan's invasion. That's still there. We'll talk about that in a bit. But I first want to give you an example of how we've seen the collective security system set up by the United Nations actually work. And so we have 2 successful examples of collective security working. So shortly after the United Nations system is established, North Korea invades South Korea. This was part of the demilitarization post-occupation of the Korean Peninsula, that there was supposed to be a withdrawal of Soviet forces from the north and U.S. forces from the south, but the Soviet Union leaves behind its military hardware. The North Korean Communist Party picks that military hardware up and charges south, violating the sort of international agreements around the deoccupation of South Korea. The United Nations Security Council is called together. They meet, they vote to support an international force to go and protect South Korea and hopefully push back the North Korean advance. And that action, which does succeed and throws North Korea back, was politically possible only because of kind of a weird moment in the Security Council history, that there had been a dispute over who would hold China's seat. Would it be the Chinese Communist Party, which holds sort of mainland China, or would it be the Chinese nationalists, the Kuomintang, which had fled to Taiwan? And they were currently holding the seat. And in protest over that, the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council. And so 2 of the states that probably would have vetoed that action just happened to not be there at that particular moment. As soon as the vote passes, the Soviet Union returns to the Security Council, and essentially every other resolution related to the Korean conflict gets vetoed, and everything else has to happen through the General Assembly. So UN parliamentary politics, if you're curious. But it also flagged that international force that was assembled was something like 95, 96% US forces, with Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and British forces making up sort of the remaining contingent. It was overwhelmingly an Anglo-American force that pushed North Korea out of South Korea. The second example that we see of collective security working is in 1990 when Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. This also happens at kind of a strange moment in Security Council history. China had been more or less friendly to the United States as part of the détente with Nixon and between Nixon and China in the 1970s, that had sort of pulled China closer to the United States as a partner against the Soviet Union. So tensions between the United States and China were not particularly hostile at that particular moment. In addition, the Soviet Union was going through a crisis of governance. There was internal conflict. I believe this corresponds with the period in which Mikhail Gorbachev is placed under house arrest and is essentially freed only by mass demonstrations in the streets. And so he's not necessarily looking to play a heavy hand in international affairs. In fact, he tells President George Bush Sr. To basically just do what you want to do with regards to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. And so the Security Council votes and nobody vetoes this action. The international force that responds, that pushes Iraq out of Kuwait, is slightly less Anglo-American dominant. I think U.S. forces make up only about 90%, with a number of Arab armies contributing as well. So again, we're seeing this sort of idea of successful collective security, the international community rallying to confront aggressor states, but it happens both at moments of sort of weirdness in terms of great power politics. It also comes at a time when there's a powerful state that's willing to shoulder the bulk of the operational load for the military action required. And both cases are pretty clear-cut cases of aggression, right, where one state is actively going after another state, and it's pretty clear what's happening. Those are pretty rare scenarios for collective security to work. Oftentimes, when states declare war on each other, try to take territory, it's less clear who's the out-and-out aggressor. Even if one state seems to be on the offense, they oftentimes have a justification for that they were provoked in some way, that they had to take this action, that it's actually self-defense, even though it looks like they're carving off territory. I think a really good example of this is the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. If I'm just looking at the surface level of like what happens, Iraq invades Iran. Like that's a clear-cut case of invasion. And yet, if you drill down just even a little bit, what you find is that, yes, you can make a case that Iran broke with the United States. It lost its superpower client. It was at a moment of military vulnerability, and Saddam Hussein, struck at Iran, seeking to carve out territory. That's a plausible story. But it's also plausible, based on the facts and based on the way that things played out, that Iran had gone through a revolution. It was looking to spread its revolution, and it was spreading its revolution into Iraq, mobilizing the large Shia population in the south of Iraq, militarizing them, that there had been attacks on Saddam Hussein, and that he saw this new Iranian regime as an existential threat to the survival of Iraq, and struck at Iran not because he was seeking to take territory, but instead to try to break this new Iranian regime that was threatening his hold on power. I could see a plausible case for both, and in fact, in that situation, it's hard to say who is the aggressor when one state is trying to overthrow another with covert action. Is responding self-defense, or is it aggression? It's a trickier nut to crack than we might like, and oftentimes that's the case. Oftentimes, by the time things come to out-and-out warfare, there's been a history of tension, there's been a history of buildup, and it can be a little murkier than we might expect. And certainly if states have a desire to not believe that an action by an aggressor state is out and out aggression, there's plenty of ways to sort of talk yourself out of that. The other thing that doesn't really get captured in the UN system, or there's not really a remedy for in the UN system, is what to do if one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council is the aggressor state. Right? And this has happened a number of times, right? So the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in the 1970s. The U.S. invades Iraq in 2003. In the lead up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, there was lots of Security Council debate, but it was about whether or not the international community should green light the U.S. invasion. There was essentially no discussion about the international community coming to Iraq's aid in response to this act of aggression against Saddam Hussein's regime. And even if somebody had brought a resolution to the Security Council, it would have been vetoed by the United States. Likewise, Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2007, or their invasion of Ukraine more recently, there's really no mechanism for the United Nations security system to deal with this in a functional way, which on one hand maybe isn't a huge problem, all right, it's a huge problem. I'm trying to talk myself out of it. It's a huge problem. The whole point of the collective security system is that states no longer have to think about the international system as self-help, that they no longer have to think about securing their own security by building up their military and by forming alliances, that their security comes from the broader system. And if there are states who are able to engage in aggression with impunity under that system, that might make sense politically and practically, but in terms of the system functioning to transform the international system from one of self-help to something else, to a collective security system, it's just simply not going to work. Just to, I guess, piling on with my concerns and challenges of a collective security system, I would say that the other big challenge is that you have to have a state or collection of states that are willing to bear the cost of enforcing a collective security system. The United Nations system does not have a military. It does not have a large budget that it can, tax to pay for a military. We'll talk about peacekeepers in a subsequent conversation, but peacekeepers are not a standing military force. They are provided by member states, just as collective security forces are provided by member states. And while on paper, in theory, the United Nations Security Council has the authority to compel contributions to a collective security effort, in practice, there's no real mechanism to make that happen. If states choose to not do so, there's not a lot you can do. And the numbers and the states that participate in these operations, it's a fairly small number. There's only a handful of states that are able to project power globally. And if one or more of those is not willing to step up and make the collective security system function, it's unlikely to do so. And the reason and the motivation for states to do this is either it's not going to cost me anything to do or minimally cost anything for me to do, or it's going to sort of align with my narrow self-interests, which again doesn't necessarily engender deep confidence among states that are maybe facing aggression that the international community will come to their aid, suggesting that the whole concept of collective security, while a useful framework for providing global security, isn't really going to transform the system in the way that maybe Woodrow Wilson had imagined or pitched it when he framed his 14 points and advocated for the creation of a League of Nations.